Welcome back to everybody and a good afternoon. So the next session is Rani Durgavati with our Pondicherry author, well-known Pondicherry author, Nandini Sengupta. And in conversation with her is Dr. Jayanti Ravi, the Secretary, Auroville Foundation. Just to tell you a little bit about Nandini, she is an Indian writer and journalist based in Pondicherry. She became fascinated with India's glorious past after a visit to the Ajanta-Ellora caves in 2007, and which soon inspired her to write in the historical fiction genre, and which resulted in several best-selling titles, which include The Blue Horse and Other Amazing Animals from Indian History, and the Gupta Empire trilogy. I recommend that to everybody because I've heard her read that out, which includes The King Within, The Poisoned Heart, and The Ocean's Own. Rani Durgavati is her first narrative non-fiction biography. Sounds interesting. And then let me just give you a little heads up. You've already been told about Jayanti Ravi. I'm sorry, I have to read out everybody. I can't remember everything just like that. So let me just find Jayanti Ravi. Where are you? Sorry. So Jayanti Ravi is a multifaceted individual. We can actually vouch for that. A scientist, civil servant, writer, speaker, educator, performing vocalist, and thinker. With a diverse academic background and extensive professional experience, she has authored books, published in international journals, has guided doctoral students, and served as a visiting faculty at Harvard University. Notably, as Principal Secretary and Commissioner, Rural Development in Gujarat, she spearheaded the Swachh Bharat mission and is recognized for her leadership during the COVID-19 outbreak. She is currently the Secretary of the Auroville Foundation. Welcome on the stage, both of you, please. So this is a book for everybody to see, Rani Durgavati. And remind you all, there's a bookstore which...
Good afternoon, Vanakkam. We have something very special today. This book, The Forgotten Life of a Warrior Queen, referring to Rani Durgavati. Many of you who have grown up or visited different parts of India, particularly Jabalpur, Madhya Pradesh, and recently, those of you who heard the speech of the Honorable Prime Minister on 15th August from the ramparts of the Red Fort. I don't know if you heard it, but when I saw that, and by then I knew I'm going to have this privilege, this opportunity of sharing or discussing Nandini's book, he did mention that this year is the 500th birth anniversary of Rani Durgavati. So what a beautiful coincidence that we're doing this. I also want to share a little bit of a personal story here. Many of us grew up with the staple food of what was called Amar Chitra Kathas. Rings a bell for many of you? How many of you remember this? See, we see this is a Kodak moment. And I want to share that somewhere around the time I was in 6th grade, there were many Amar Chitra Kathas, but there was one on Rani Durgavati. I had read it then. There was something about her story that really got tattooed in my heart and mind. And much later, when one would again read Amar Chitra Kathas with my children and so on, this book would go and do something to me there. And I can tell, and Anu can vouch for it, I had no idea she's going to pair me up with Rani Durgavati and Nandini. It was just, as we say, a lot of these plans are made by both of them up there. And I feel very happy today that this is being shared with you. And Nandini the more I get to know about what all she has done, all her achievements and her contribution and her life story, I feel very, very happy. So this is, as Anu mentioned, it is a non-fiction book, but which really, and perhaps the most authentic researched work on a queen who still, after 500 years, there are temples in her honor across. So she has really survived space and time, and she's somebody who's identified with her namesake, Durga, and the tradition that we all belong to. Sri Aurobindo and the mother is also a Shakta tradition. There's a lot of emphasis given to the mother. So I think it really rings a deep chord within all of us. And one of the first things that I wanted to ask you, Nandini, is that I remember the way you start your book. You said you went there and heard people singing these songs about her. It was the anniversary. And there are many things about her which will slowly unfold. But she was definitely an iconic woman.
Yes, she was.
But in the same breath, she was also an iconoclast. She was somebody who broke these stereotypes at that point of time, many of them even in today's date and time, that may be expected of women to do. For example, she was probably a person born in a Rajput family.
Yes.
Among communities, the Rajput community is still more traditional in terms of the maryada for women and so on. But she actually eloped in a way. Of course, there are 3 or 4 stories to that, which you have, or versions of that, and married somebody from a so-called, at that point of time, of course, a community which was not a Suvarna community in those days as it was. So that was something like breaking some of the rigid norms that society expected. She went on to also become martial art training, a ruler. She even had to take some strategic decisions of having a few people who were a threat, having them removed out of the way, including her own brother-in-law. And the kind of leadership that she showed, she ruled for a long time, administration, not just in terms of one dimension, but so much. So how do you think this thing of her being an icon and an iconoclast, what are the different features of it? And why was this somewhere lost? Why is it that every girl, when you ask them, what are the real, names, immediately Lakshmi Bai, it is not to say that Rani Lakshmi Bai is not, but this is Rani Durgavati is not a name that immediately comes on the lips of any young girl in India or the world. So the question is, what were the qualities about her that really were endearing to the people, made her beloved, and yet she was an epitome of courage and compassion, and yet endured. So even today, after so much of time, people worship her. Yeah. So would you like to throw some light on it?
Thank you so much, Jayanti. So, when I started researching Rani Durgavati as a modern woman, and I'd like to call myself a feminist, it seemed to me peculiar that this was a medieval monarch who was the most modern woman I have ever come across in history. And that's saying something, because as you rightly said, this is a lady who lived in the 16th century, right? She died in 1564. Next year, 2024, is her 500th anniversary, as the Prime Minister said in his August 15th speech. So she lived in an age very, very different from our own. And it is always very tempting to use today's prisms and ideologies and superimpose them on an age which did not really understand those ideologies and prisms. But even so, if feminism is all about agency, about doing stuff because you're taking responsibility for it, then Rani Durgavati is a feminist icon. And the reason why I found her interesting was that there were 2-3 points. First, of course, like you said, she kept pushing the envelope. She was a young Chandel Rajput princess. Chandel Rajputs were, in terms of lineage, they were very, they were right on top of the sort of food chain, as it were. And she fell in love with, which in itself is interesting because in medieval anywhere, not just India. Royal marriages were mostly diplomatic alliances. They were not romantic alliances. 9 out of 10 times, they were diplomatic alliances. But Rani Durgavati, actually, there's a very, very sweet meet cute that they have. She bumps into her future husband while visiting her Kuladevi Mandir, Manaya Devi temple near Kalinjar Fort. Kalinjar Fort, just a little bit of history right here, because you'll have to understand how precarious the political scenario was when these two teenagers were meeting, falling in love, and all of that was happening. Kalinjar Fort in central India is known today because that's where Afghan monarch Shah Suri lost his life. So Shah, there was an interregnum between the Mughals, between Humayun and Akbar, when the throne of Delhi or power in Delhi shifted to the Afghans, to Shah Suri and later on his son, Ismail Shah Suri. Shah had a central Indian campaign. He brought his army down to Bundelkhand and then to Kalinjar, and in an attempt to storm the fort, was very badly wounded and died. So this is the place where there was a temple. The temple still stands. If you go to central India, you can go visit that temple. Beautiful little temple. And that's where the ruler of Kalinjar Fort, Kirat Rai, was the main line of the Chandel dynasty. He had invited Rajgond Prince Dalpat Shah for a hunt. It was like a hunt visit, hunt diplomacy. And that's where Durgavati and Dalpati meet. They fall in love. Durgavati's father, of course, had no desire to marry her off to a boy who came from a very prosperous and strong kingdom, but he was a tribal Gond. He was not Rajput. So in the medieval context, an intercaste marriage was not something that a Chandel Rajput ruler would be particularly comfortable with. So Shalivahan, who was the branch line of the Chandel dynasty, decided that he was going to have a Swayamvar, which is the ancient Indian custom of calling a bunch of rulers, and the princess will then go and ostensibly choose whoever, but pretty much she was schooled who to choose, making it a diplomatic marriage. Durgavati tipped off the priest of Manaya Devi temple, sent a message to her boyfriend saying, I don't want to marry these guys. Please come and rescue me. He comes, storms her palace, whisks her away, takes her home, and they get married. Very whirlwind, very romantic. Pushing the envelope. Point number one. Then what happens is that, her husband, tragically, 7 years later, he passes away. She is left a grieving widow. She is very, very young at this stage. She is just about 25 years old. She has a little boy. He's just, some historians say he's 3 years old, some say he's 5. He's a minor, he's a baby. She also has a grudging brother-in-law lurking in the background who has very interesting ideas of running the kingdom himself. What does she do? She emphatically gives up parda. Remember, we are talking about 16th century India, all right? She gives up parda. She takes over as the regent of her kingdom. She wins over key courtiers in her husband's court. She fobs off this grudging brother-in-law, so much so that he leaves the kingdom, and as long as she is alive, he never sets foot back in Garha, which is her kingdom. She takes over as the queen. She rules her kingdom with so much efficiency. She is not only great at ensuring security of her people, but she's also excellent at ensuring their prosperity, which in a bit we will talk about. So much so that for 500 years, her people sing about her not only as an ideal monarch, but as a goddess. And I cannot think of too many people, at least from Indian history, who are historical characters who have been deified into a goddess. And today, if you go to Jabalpur, if you go to her Samadhi Sthal, the point where she died, in battle, mind you, you will find young Gond women, and I just went there. June 24th is her Balidan Divas, her sacrifice day when she died. Young Gond women, they go and worship her with flower, with song, with what they call diya bati. You know, they put an earthen lamp and they offer their prayers to her. She's a goddess. And I have researched Gond folk and bardic songs. For 500 years, they talk about her as a celestial being, interchangeable with her namesake, which is Durga. So this is a remarkable woman, and she is remarkable on so many counts, which, Jayanti, you and I were discussing this, that, as modern women, we have an idea of feminism, which has its roots in the West, obviously, because the whole idea of feminism, as we know it, has come from the West. But if you look at somebody like Durgavati, she is a feminist in a different mold. She does all of her different duties in a manner that allows her to keep a balance on both sides of her life. So, wife, lover.
This point, I just thought, so here, this is where, as we were discussing, Nandini, this ideal of a Sanatan woman, normally in today's construct, a lot of times, I've seen this also in our workplaces. If there's somebody who's really doing well on the work front, there is an assumption that, well, you've had to, the two things are believed to be impossible to synergize or synthesize. Well, on the home front, well, that must be taking a back seat, or that you can't be an author and, multi-potentialite or something like that. And here you saw her, she was a lover, a wife, mother, and a very beautiful, charming lady, also trained in all of this, but also a politician, a very astute politician.
And a warrior.
Warrior.
Which we will come to in a bit.
An administrator, and somebody who was also known as the Rani of Tal Talavari.
Lady of the Lakes.
So yes. 52 lakes. To really balance all of this and have this holistic, the integral persona that Mother and Sri Aurobindo talks of. So this is again something which is, and all the time embedded in dharma, in the sense what she did, even the end, I think the way she ends her life, the situation, the circumstances, it's absolutely poignant, touching, and deeply elevating and inspiring too. So how is it that this kind of wholesome, why is it that our textbooks, and how do we now make these unknown people who've really been absolutely big lamps, big lighthouses of energy and of really inspiration for all of us. So what is it about her, and how do we take this forward?
So, Jayanti, the reason I find Rani Durgavati so inspiring is because she is a perfect combination of feminism and femininity. There is no clash in her character between the two. You find her being eulogized by her court poets, as well as Mughal chroniclers, as well as British civilians. So people who have absolutely no reason to eulogize her have written about her in the deepest of purple prose, right? They talk about her grace, they talk about her beauty, they also talk about how fierce she is in the battlefield. Remember that she, in her 15-year rule, she had more than 50 skirmishes to face, 50, and she remained unvanquished, except in the last battle of her life, which, by the way, was spread over 2 days, and in the first day, she was victorious. In the second day too, she would have won if her generals had taken her advice. They did not. They were on a high because they had won the first day against the mighty Mughal army. And they did not listen to her strategic advice. That's the reason why they lost the second day. And that was the first loss in her life. So this is an exceptional warrior. She was an exceptional administrator, and we'll just come in just a bit. We'll come to what she did in terms of administration. But the interesting thing is, why was a person like this, an utterly inspiring woman, why was she forgotten? And this is my big peeve with Indian history. If you just go out on the streets and you ask the lay person about mention 3 important people from Indian history. And they will go Ashoka the Great, Akbar the Great. All the greats are all men. You know, it's almost as if our history didn't have feisty, kick-ass women, but we did. We did have them. We didn't just have them in our itihasa. We had them in our historical past. And I believe that Indian history's male gaze is partly to blame for relinquishing Rani Durgavati to the sidelines. But there are other reasons. The other reasons are also that her kingdom of Garha Mandla or Garha Katanga, was a tribal kingdom. So our history's gaze also has a peculiar fixation with Delhi / Patliputra. Anything that doesn't happen there, it's almost like it didn't happen at all. But for a country like India, when we have the kind of diverse spread that we do, our history cannot be monochromatic. It has to be a patchwork quilt. And characters like Rani Durgavati cannot become footnotes in their own story. Last but not the least, unfortunately, her adversary was a man who was another the Great, Akbar. And given how long a shadow this noble monarch casts on our history, is it any wonder that his adversaries would be turned into a footnote? I mean, it's not just Rani Durgavati. There was another woman who gave Akbar grief. Her name was Chand Bibi. There were 2 women who tormented Akbar. One was Rani Durgavati, the other was Chand Bibi. Both have been relegated to the sidelines of history. So I think Rani Durgavati's descent into becoming a footnote happened much later. If you look at her contemporaries, Mughal chroniclers like, Abul Fazl, of course, he was Akbar's court hagiographer, but the terms in which he talks about Rani Durgavati, given that she was an adversary, is unbelievably generous. Even Badauni, whose tone turns extremely nasty towards the end, talks of her as a lady of great good sense and grace and valor. There are others like Ferishta. There are Brahmin, court chroniclers, Sanskrit poets, temple inscriptions. But more interestingly, later Indologists. By the 18th, late 18th and mid 19th centuries, Central India was being mapped by a bunch of British civilians. Each one of them, starting with William Henry Thuggy Schliemann, of course, he has written extensively about Rani Durgavati, Alexander Cunningham, James Prinsep, all of these people, and of course, American Indologists like Fritz Edward Hall, all of them speak of her in the most glowing terms, to the extent that James Forsyth, another explorer, British explorer, calls her the Indian Boudica. So she is seen. There is another gentleman called Mr. Chatterton. He was a local padre. He was a local priest. He calls her the very embodiment of Sita. So these are again men. They are, if you look at the way they talk about Rani Durgavati's tribal subjects, they are all age appropriately racist. They do not have, glowing terms of praise for her people. But she as a person shines. And yet we have managed to forget her. In the last 60, 70 years, she has been forgotten by the rest of India. Her people remember her. If you go to Jabalpur, you catch any, and I have done that. As a journalist, I found it most interesting. I would sit at the temple square or I'd sit at a, place, and I would ask people, do you remember? And every single one of them would have a story. Some of them far-fetched, some of them rooted in history, some of them imaginary, but they remember. They sing about her. They talk about her. So she's alive.
And this point that you made about synthesizing or straddling femininity and feminist, an attitude. Feminism is a term that came later, but the fact that she embodied all those aspects, she really stood up for her people, took on mantles which were otherwise meant to be a purely male-dominated world, and so on. But again, now if you look at how did she straddle her secular duties with the sacred duties, Because again, she was somebody, if we talk of sustainable agriculture, if we talk of organic agriculture, we talk of fathers of modern agriculture. I think she could well have been somebody who really sowed the seeds of modern agriculture in a real sustainable way in India. So a little bit about that angle as well, and her commitment to temples, which is talked about for Rani Ahalyabai, but not so much. We don't hear about it as much.
So it's very interesting, because if you look at her secular, the secular work that she did, she is known as the Tal Talao Rani, or Lady of the Lakes. She's credited with having excavated or dug 52 big water bodies and another 12 or 14 smaller water bodies. Remember, this is central India. This area has always been rain parched, and of course she was also sort of continuing the work that her father-in-law started, Sangram Shah. They together turned this area into a grain bowl, and so much so, her kingdom became very prosperous, very, very rich, not only because they were exporting forest produce like chironji seeds or honey. Elephants were a big source of income for her, but they were also exporting grain. This is a rain-parched land that became a source of grain exports to places like Gujarat and the Deccan. And where do we find this? We find this in Abul Fazl's Akbarnama. He mentions this. So she was one of the first people to encourage a system of agriculture where she would ask her tribal population to come and water a piece of land and turn it arable. So this is a piece of land, you water it, you make it good enough to cultivate, it's yours. That was a system that she followed, and as a result of which, this kingdom, which was basically, near the Bundelkhand area, parched, mountainous, full of, plateaus and hills and all of that, became a green, water body driven grain bowl. And today, if you go and talk to, and which I did, when you go and talk to Jabalpur historians, they talk about how Jabalpur itself has lost its characters because most of the 99% of those water bodies have now vanished. So Jabalpur's, for so long, for 500 years, the place did not have a water problem. The place was cool, it was green, it's losing that because they're losing the legacy of the Rani. And there's a quick mention that I want to make. In 1861, this is immediately after the uprising of 1857, 1858, 1861, Sir Richard Temple is made the person in charge, the British civilian in charge of what was then known as central provinces, which included all of Madhya Pradesh, parts of Maharashtra, Orissa, and southern part of Bihar. Is a huge territory. Richard Temple is quoted as saying that he went and looked at this network of canals and lakes that had been, put in place by people like Rani Durgavati and maintained for the next 300 odd years by members of her own family. And there is a passage where he says that this is excellent work because those canals, those water bodies are doing what they are meant to do. They're keeping the water table high. They're keeping the area arable. And now we've lost it. So it just goes to show that, she was an excellent administrator. Of course, we'll talk in a bit about how she kept the borders safe. But along with that came her temple duties. There are many, many references to the yagnas and the havans that she did, temple consecrations. There are several temples associated with her name. Unusually, again, a lot of the queens, the temples, at least in the 16th century, if we look at it, a lot of the temples consecrated by Indian queens are associated with Shakti, Kali. And in fact, Rani Durgavati's initial, the Sharda Mata temple is also a Shakti temple. But she is also associated with the Shiva temple, which she consecrated on the banks in Barman Ghat in Narsinghpur district of Madhya Pradesh. If you go and see, the temple still stands and, It gets its fair share of devotees. I did what journalists do. I went and sat there at in the courtyard and interviewed people. Every single one of them had a story about the Rani. So that's how she merged the two.
So we've got a bit of an idea about her. Of course, we don't want to give away too much because we want more and more people to actually go and buy this book, read this book, which is so inspiring. But now, at a personal level, I have two questions because I don't want to overshoot the time. I'm assuming you had somebody from, I mean, if there's the celebration of the 500th year, which is definitely, it has been announced from the ramparts of the Red Fort by none other than our Honorable Prime Minister, if that were to happen. What do you think could be befitting, since I do not think such a deeply researched work has really happened on her life as yet. This is perhaps the first. What could be ways of really taking this forward? And what is the 3 or 4 messages from her life that are absolutely relevant today for youngsters, for people across India and the world? Any thoughts on it?
So, Rani Durgavati's story is a story of memories. Why she was remembered, why she is remembered, why she was forgotten. And the best tribute that we can pay to her is by remembering her, by remembering, by revering, by restoring her legacy. That's how we can pay tribute to her. We can bring her back into the mainstream. We can give her a voice that is her own. We can stop making her a footnote in history. That is the biggest tribute, honestly. And I was very fortunate in my last trip to Jabalpur. I got to meet a lot of PhD students, many of them tribal Gond, and they are doing exceptional work on Rani Durgavati, on her agricultural systems, on her political acumen, on her martial traditions. And it was so empowering for me to see that her legacy is being kept alive by the people who adopted her as their own, even though she was not tribal Gond. So it's time the rest of India followed suit.
As I was reading this, of course, it's a part of the story. One of the things that really touched me is we speak of agency, which she did. Even at the point of, eventually the last moment of her life, so to say, she didn't want to be captured by the enemy and be taken there and so on. So she decided to end her life.
I want to make a point here. See, for too long, the idea of the perfection of Indian womanhood is an exemplary sacrificial mode that people talk about. That the Indian woman is strong because she's able to sacrifice. I want to say that although Rani Durgavati's end is a sacrifice, it is the ultimate sacrifice. For her, you have to understand that this was tactical. It was driven by a deep understanding of what was going on around her. She was first and foremost a politician. She was a warrior. She was driven to a point where she realized that because of a series of missteps taken by her generals, she was now cornered. The climate, the weather had turned hostile. It was raining, the rivers, and she was in a ravine. Is a deep defile. They were doing tactical warfare. The Mughal armies were 5 times larger than her own forces. Her army did not have cannons. Her only weapon was the terrain. She was using the terrain. They were in a ravine. It started to rain. The Gaur river started to flood. She was getting stuck in the ravine. Her elephant, Sarman, was very badly wounded. She realized that she did not have a way out. Remember also that earlier in the day, her teenage son gets injured. She sends him away to the safety of her capital city in Chauragar. She knows that he will survive and fight another day. She knows the battle is not over. At that point, she chooses, in her own words, death over dishonor. So this is sacrifice. I agree. But this is also a tactical decision not to allow the enemy to defile, to dishonor. She is like, I will not bow my head. This is bullying. I am not going to bow down to a bully. But I will make sure that I keep an option open for my son to fight another day, which he did.
But here, there was something that touched me also. The fact that she asks one of the surviving persons with her to, aim the arrow at her and actually shoot her, which he refuses to. He says, I can't do that to you. Then she takes the agency onto herself and ends her own life. So that's again something agency at its.
That's at every point. This is a lady who took decisions herself. And the only time when she was not allowed to take that decision, when the generals went against her, against the night raid idea, that's when she flounders. But even at the end, when she's asking the Mahout, the guy who's handling her elephant, she's saying, listen, I have no way out. Please kill me. I am not going to be captured alive. And he says, I can't do it. Once again, a man is letting her down. And this time she says, fine, you don't want to do it? I'm going to do it. This is a woman who's deeply inspiring because at no point does she give up agency. That's why I'm saying that she was an utterly modern woman.
Another question now, because Nandini, we've heard of a movie. There's another Rani there, Rani Roopmati, that also gets often spoken about. What do you see? Both of them belonged more or less to that same region, the same area. And of course, she too, I've also visited Mandu and seen the place from where she used to worship Narmada and so on. So how do you contrast both of them? I know they're quite different, but also there's a lot of similarity in some ways with them.
So so Roopmati is the antithesis of Rani Durgavati. Roopmati is the ashik. She is a mashuk. She is the mashuk. She is the lover. And her husband / lover was this famous king of Malwa called Baz Bahadur. Now, I want to make a little bit of history clear at this point. A lot of our popular imagination has romanticized the love between Roopmati and Baz Bahadur. And the core of their love, of course, is his love of music. She was a very beautiful singer. She was beautiful and a good singer and so on. And so their whole love story, if you go to Mandu also, the Song and Light show will talk about their love story. Now here's what the Song and Light show does not tell you. Two things. Number one, Baz Bahadur may have been an ashik, but he was a most feckless character. That's what history tells us. What does he do? He finds out that his neighbor is a queen called Rani Durgavati. She is reigning over a very, very prosperous kingdom. He says, but she is just a woman. I'm going to swoop in and I'm going to see if I can take away parts of her land. He tries to do that. She gives him such a nosebleed reply. He loses every single one of his men. His entire army is decimated. And he goes back alone, back to Mandu. And according to Ferishta, he's so disappointed and so heartbroken at being given such a, nosebleed reply. He immerses himself in wine and song. Very Bollywood of him. And then what does he do with his mashuk, his famous lover, Roopmati? When Akbar's milk brother, Adham Khan, gets enticed not only by Mandu's fabulous wealth, but also by how beautiful Roopmati was supposed to be, and attacks Malwa, Baz Bahadur is again defeated. As we can see, he was no great warrior. He must have been great at singing, but he wasn't that great at swinging a sword. So instead of running away with Roopmati, he leaves Roopmati to the tender mercies of a marauding Mughal general and runs away. Roopmati, when faced with the choice of joining Adham Khan's harem, chooses to drink poison and dies. Adham Khan, of course, gets the rest of the treasure, and then, what happens to him is another story. But what does Baz Bahadur do? Baz Bahadur runs away and seeks shelter with the Sisodias, which is one of the triggers for Akbar to turn his gaze towards Chittor, which 4 years later, turns into the most brutal campaign in Akbar's reign, which was the siege of Chittor, in which 30,000 people were killed, summarily killed. But Baz Bahadur runs away from Chittor also. And suddenly, 10 years later, he pops up in Akbar's court. And he's renowned for a new kind of music called Bazkhani. So this is a very, very interesting man, a man for all seasons, I must say. But the difference between Roopmati and Durgavati is that Roopmati does not show any agency. She is just a pawn. Durgavati shows agency.
Lovely. Now, how has this book, what has it changed in your life? The process of, working on it, working through it, completing it, reading it.
Where do I even begin? I mean, I've been obsessed with Rani Durgavati for well over 4 or 5 years now. Every time I go to Jabalpur, I feel like I've come home. I have never seen a more inspiring figure. For me, this is history evangelism. She is a character who I feel a lot of respect for. I look up to. I think she is a role model for all modern women, all women who think of themselves as feminists. I think she's a great role model. And I want to show you here this picture of Rani Durgavati. If any of you are interested in visiting Chennai Museum, you will find this portrait of her. This is a contemporary portrait of Rani Durgavati. As you can see, she is wearing the Rajput poshak. She's very beautiful. She looks very feminine. She looks very much like a beautiful, very in love queen. But if you look at the picture of her painted in Akbarnama, which, might I add, we could not access because it is currently sitting in the V&A, and they charge a mighty fee for Indian researchers to access something that has been essentially stolen from us. But that document is sitting in the V&A, and if you look at that picture, she is clad in the, like she's dressed like a man. She's wearing the Jama Poshak and trousers. She has a sword, she has bow and arrow, she's wearing chain mail. If you go to Jabalpur, all over the murtis that show her, she's holding a sword in hand. She is no coy symbol of femininity. So in her, you see both the feminine and the warrior. You see both the lover and the warrior. You see both heart and sword. You see a balance of both.
In fact, this picture too, I mean, the size of the sword that's behind us, it's almost as tall as her, and if you went by scale. So I think this is wonderful. And what are the next things now, next projects? After Durgavati, who is going to be your next?
I would like to do more biographies of Indian queens who have been forgotten. There are many. Many of them have not been written about enough. Certainly there haven't been biographies dedicated to them, properly researched biography. I must say that this is the first biography on Rani Durgavati in English. There haven't been any books written on her specifically dedicated to her, nothing at all. So there is a lacuna, and hopefully I'll manage to do something about it.
And just as I see Anu standing up, I think I'll take the 30 seconds she comes here to suggest something here. Some years back, we had a chairman at Auroville called Professor Kiri Joshi. I think many of you may have heard of him and worked with him. He had started something beautiful, making monographs of people who were inspiring figures from different countries and civilizations. For example, you have people from 60 countries here. So can we really look at those qualities that really, the epitome of courage, or somebody who really stood for truth, somebody who stood for uniting, like Jean Monnet, the person who was responsible in a way for doing all that is the basis of European Union. So one thought for you and many of the authors here, I see Peggy Mohan here, many of you eminent people, Sanjeev sir as well, of course. Is there a possibility that while this Auroville LitFest, it's just taking its birth, it's just beginning, can we also think of having a few monographs like this happen so that by next year, this can be a small but a very, very promising outcome of what we all here did. And if you really look at such characters, many of them, they're there. India is replete with many such people. But it's just that, and even the world, it's not just about India. I'm sure there are women, men of this kind, like you said, the fact that it's a double, it's a tribal background and it's a woman and so on and so forth. So somewhere she's lost and relegated. So if there is a way to list out some of these inspiring figures, certain attributes of theirs, I think it would be a great contribution, especially for young women, young girls, young children from across the world, because these qualities can inspire a man as well. Somebody to have actually made 52 talavs, water bodies. I was actually imagining as I was reading this, if you climbed up that hillock and morning as the sun reflects, sometimes have you experienced this when the plane is landing on a city which has got solar panels? I see Tuan here. You see all of it reflecting light. It almost feels like water bodies all around, but that's not a water body. Of course, that's also something to do to conserve the environment. But here, if you really had these 52 water bodies, it would be such a beautiful, the very thought of all of it, harnessing, making sure that, so I think these are things that again need to be documented, reinforced, repeated, and transmitted to as many young men and women to really, again, go back to that inherent, the good set of values which Mother and Sri Aurobindo getting it back here, these qualities where you really have the highest aspiration, not just aspire for small things. It's not just for money, knowledge, wealth, but for something which goes beyond all of that. And then really see how we can be agents of change like she did so bravely, so gallantly, and made the ultimate sacrifice of her life. I think before Anu comes up, we're doing a before time arrival, as they say. Or is there any questions now? We throw it open to the floor for your questions. And again, want to really thank Nandini for thinking of something as special as this and presenting it to the whole world.
There's a question. There's a question.
Yeah. So yeah, please come forward.
Hello, ma'am. I really enjoyed listening about this book and looking forward to read it. So first there's a question and then maybe a comment or an observation. So I just wanted to ask about the methodology that you deployed while writing this book, because, when you start relying upon the bards and popular imagination and legends and stories and narratives going all around, I'm sure there's a very thin line between history and fiction. And to avoid that getting crossed over, how did you manage to sort of filter history out from the fiction and popular narratives? And the comment that I wanted to make perhaps is, perhaps how would you react to this if I say that we should be careful, while certain qualities like ensuring sustainability, like digging up ponds and nurturing the people and ensuring their safety and security are valuable feminine traits and they must be treasured. At the same time, we must be cautioned enough to celebrate a woman only when she adopts the traits of a masculine, misogynist, violent man. So suppose she's dressed like a man, taking a sword and butchering people. That shouldn't be celebrated as a feminine trait. Thank you.
I would disagree. I am a woman. I certainly don't want to be a man.
Thank you.
I do not wish to be a man. I don't think being a strong woman requires me to be a man.
Absolutely.
And okay, so that's one part of your story. But thank you for asking the methodology. In the case of Rani Durgavati, I have to make it very clear, I'm not a historian, I'm a journalist. I approached this as a journalist would. I looked at primary sources. There are several primary sources there. Like I said, there are Mughal chroniclers, there are temple inscriptions, there are secular sources, Sanskrit poetry, several manuscripts written during her reign, all of which gives information of her reign, which was contemporary, which was written when she was alive. That's the primary source. The secondary source are, of course, the British Indologists and what they have written about her. And then came all the bardic references, folk songs, folk tales, popular imagination, popular memory. These are not these are not history. But you see, you have to understand that these are also important because they tell you, A, what people remember, and B, why they remember it that way. So if you like, for instance, there are lots of songs about Philosopher's Stone. Okay, now we know that the Rajgons didn't have a Philosopher's Stone. There is nothing called a Philosopher's Stone. But if a bunch of people firmly believe that the Rajgons had a Philosopher's Stone, that is an indication that the Rajgons were phenomenally wealthy. And that is borne by the fact that you have numismatic evidence of that. You see? So you have to be careful about sifting through the material that you're getting from bardic references. But you will find that at the core, most of these songs and stories have history. They have history at their heart. So the idea is to get at the heart.
That's very nice, ma'am. Maybe we have more such heroes coming up through this process of writing. So I must thank you very much for this.
What is your name?
I'm Satinder Singh. Where are you from? Ma'am, I'm from Pondicherry. I'm in Pondicherry Civil Services.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
What's the closest place to Auroville? What's the closest temple for Rani Durgavati here?
First, tell us, what is your name?
Rishika.
Okay, Rishika. So Rani Durgavati did not rule in Auroville. You have to take a plane and go to Jabalpur.
Yeah, I'm asking the closest place around here.
Not here. You have to go to Jabalpur. Jabalpur is in Madhya Pradesh. Do you know the map of India?
Yeah.
So in the heart of India, there's a state called Madhya Pradesh.
Yeah.
And if you go there, there is a place called Jabalpur. And that was more or less in and around Jabalpur was her kingdom. And once you go there, you'll find her everywhere.
Okay. Are there other books like this? Because I'm very interested in these stories.
Oh, that is lovely to know. You should read this book and you should become like Rani Durgavati. Would you like to be like Rani Durgavati? Good girl.
I think this one question makes us feel that this session was worth it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.